Hi, I'm Alex, and today I want to talk about one of my favorite composers, Beethoven. Now, I think when most people think of Beethoven, they probably think of one of these pieces, either the opening from the Fifth Symphony, or maybe the beginning of Moonlight Sonata. Or perhaps even, sometimes annoyingly, Erolica. But the unfortunate thing is that, these pieces are nice, but they really do a disservice of describing what Beethoven really has to offer throughout his entire catalog. So today we'll be discussing Beethoven's three compositional periods as they appear in his piano sonatas. First, we'll be looking at the Opus 2 number 2, which represents his earliest period of composition. And then we'll be looking at the Apache, which is a cornerstone of the middle period, the heroic period. And lastly, we'll be looking at the Opus 109, which is a gorgeous example of his late works. I'll talk about the unique characteristics of these pieces and how these characteristics tie in to Beethoven's compositional techniques during those periods. So first, let's talk about the Opus 2 number 2. Opus 2 was Beethoven's first collection of piano sonatas. The Opus 2 number 2 specifically is very elegant, joyful, and humorous. If you think of it in relation to a food, it would be like a light sorbet that you'd have on a summer day. In this period, Beethoven was mastering the techniques of his time while also trying to develop a personal voice. A lot of the times, he would write very large structures with lots of material during this period. He hadn't quite mastered the technique of using a single idea to create the material for an entire piece, so there's a lot of varied material in these pieces during this period. Most of the piano sonatas he wrote during this period are in 4 movements, and this is one of those. Let's have a look at this wonderful sonata. The first movement is in Sonata Form, and it marks the beginning of Beethoven's attempts to expand the sonata form. 3 parts form this main theme. First, then we have and lastly in this primary theme we have beginning to experiment a bit more with sonata form. Beethoven moves to E minor instead of E major. He modulates during this theme, and it has a very theatrical, dramatic ending that's just wonderful. So here's the beginning. Then he moves on to this wonderful theatrical ending to the second theme. Then there's a closing theme based primarily upon motives from the third part of the primary theme. And so on. Then Beethoven begins the development section. This is kind of in 2 parts. This first part utilizes the motive from the very beginning of the piece and deals in third relationships. So the movement started in A, but now we suddenly jump to C. Then A flat. Then there's a second part to this development that primarily builds upon the second motive from the primary theme. The piece then moves on to the recapitulation, which is pretty standard in terms of classical sonatas. The one thing that Beethoven does maintain that is slightly different from most is that he puts the secondary theme in the tonic minor rather than the tonic major, but this kind of helps keep the original character of the secondary theme as it appeared in the exposition. piece ends without a coda on the closing theme, this time in the tonic major, that existed in the exposition. And that's the end of the first movement. This slow movement of Beethoven's, the second movement, is very typical of slow movements from this period. Very ponderous and slow, almost can feel like it's dragging if it's played incorrectly. But it's absolutely beautiful if you're patient enough to listen to the long melodies that Beethoven is creating. This slow hymn-like section that evokes thoughts of string quartets alternates with a more solo-like section in which the melody is passed between different voices. And this helps frame the rondo. The C section of this piece is pretty typical, but Beethoven manages to build in some absolutely beautiful, transcendent sort of moments that will become a staple of his slow movements as he advances throughout his career. And so on, until we get back to the primary theme once again, the A section. The end of this piece contains something important to Beethoven's later compositions. What he does here is he has a massive coda that's about half the size of the rest of the piece. It makes up almost a full third of the piece, and making large codas like this that are structurally significant on their own is something that's very characteristic of his heroic period, especially. The character changes a lot. It's the primary material, but it's treated very differently. He then transitions back into the A theme, but this time it's in a lighter pastoral sort of setting. The third movement is the first time that Beethoven uses the word scherzo in his piano sonatas. It's exactly like a minuet and trio, but much lighter and more humorous. This movement begins with a very light, happy, cheerful motive. The middle section of the scherzo is much more lyrical, and interestingly, it's in G sharp minor, which is a much more chromatic movement than one might expect. After a repeat of the first part of the scherzo, the whole piece then moves on to the trio, which is much smoother, more melodic as a whole, and it utilizes some very interesting accents that begin in the alto line. accents then eventually move to the bass and soprano. Then we get a return to the scherzo for the end of this movement. Now we go to the last movement, the rondo. This is labeled grazioso, which means graceful, and it's it's very light, like the last movement, but it's not quite so fast. There's a sense of elegance to it all the way throughout. It opens up with an arpeggiated A major chord and then a melody, underpinned by Alberti bass. Then Beethoven utilizes a little bit of polyphony, similar to what we heard in the first movement, and this kind of foreshadows what's to come in his later periods. The transition section passes material between the hands and is even lighter than A. This then breaks into the B section, which does have Alberti bass, but it's a diminution of the one that appears in A. Now we get a return to A. Every single time that A is repeated, it gets more elaborate and complicated at the beginning with the arpeggio. The C section is very different from the other sections of this piece, which clearly sets this aside as being a 7-part rondo rather than a sonata rondo. It's very loud, it's in triplets, it's in a minor key, and it almost sounds like it's pounding. The A section and B section both repeat again, as is typical in a piece like this, and the B section, as is also typical, is now in the tonic key. Then there is a large coda, similar to the second movement, that repeats elements from both A and C. Actually does so in a very similar manner to what we see in the second movement, where the primary theme returns at the very end to close off the piece. Beethoven is very good at giving a sense of completion to pieces using this method. And then the A theme, again, at the very, very end. And so on, and then finally, and that ends the Sonata Opus 2, number 2. Next, we move on to Beethoven's middle heroic period, and the piece that encapsulates the spirit of this era is his Apache piano sonata. This is the crown jewel of the heroic period and really represents Beethoven's heroic style along with the Symphony No. 3, Erolica. This piece is passionate, complex, and tragic. If I were to compare this to a food, then instead of it being the light sorbet of the last sonata, this work is much more like a rich, heavy steak dinner. This period is full of imaginative works that depict the extremes of the human experience, and they also stretch the instruments of Beethoven's time. Grand triumph is a very common theme in these, hence the name heroic style, but it is equally matched by irredeemable despair and terrible emptiness. And this matches what was going on in Beethoven's life at the time as well. He was slowly growing deaf, and he was having to come to terms with that and what that meant for his career. And he was terribly isolated and lonely, and he even thought about killing himself on multiple occasions, but he decided not to because he wanted to live for his music, and he wanted to give all that he had to his music, and he didn't want to leave the world without having said everything that he wanted to say, that he had to say. The Apache Sonata showcases all of these elements beautifully and tragically. This first movement starts right off the bat with the extremes that I was mentioning not too long ago. Beethoven begins with this descending, ominous melody at the very bottom of the piano that he had at the time. And the notes are separated by 2 octaves, which gives a greater sense of emptiness and sort of tragedy. This whole movement is a sonata form, and this is the beginning of the primary theme. Soon, the extremes come to full light as Beethoven explodes this piece with a stunning arpeggio down the length of the entire piano in forte. After a transitional section, we get the secondary theme, which is very slightly altered from the primary theme, yet it sounds so much different, has a much different, more soothing character, all because Beethoven added this rocking figure in the bass, and he put this in a major key. We talked about third relationships a little bit ago in the first sonata, Opus 2, number 2, and Beethoven explores this even more here, ending the exposition not in the dominant, but in a key a third away from the tonic. This begins the development. The development is sprawling. It's fantastic in its scope. It's absolutely stunning, but it doesn't feel too long, even though it takes up the majority of this piece's time, because Beethoven zips through different motives in different settings so quickly. It's really fantastic how he does this. Now he's beginning much more to be able to create a great deal of material based off of very few motives, in great contrast to his first works. Beethoven then sets this motive in a much more rapid, furious texture, starting in E minor and then moving through several different keys. Then he dips a little bit into the transitional material. Then he brings the second theme back in this fantastic section that moves through a few keys and slowly builds all the way up the piano in a chromatic rising line that's very characteristic of Beethoven. We saw it in the last piece, and it's sublime. Then there's an angry, tragic arpeggio section that ends the development and helps transition back into the recapitulation. The recapitulation brings the primary theme back, but this time the notes are only separated by an octave, but a different kind of tension and franticness is brought in by a repeated C in the bass that makes this feel more like a 1-6-4. As we've already seen Beethoven do with secondary themes, when he repeats the secondary theme in the Recapitulation, he does kind of do it in the tonic, but in an altered way that keeps the character of the first time the theme appeared. In the last sonata, the secondary theme was in E minor in the first movement, and he kept it in A minor in the Recapitulation, and here it was in A flat major the first time, and he keeps it in F major. If he had switched it to minor, it would lose a lot of its character and probably wouldn't seem much like the secondary theme, because that was one of the small ways he altered the original material in the first place to create a secondary theme. So here it is. Remember those enormous codas I was referring to in the last piece that I said would become much more of a staple later in Beethoven's career? Here is one of them in full glory. It stretches from measure 204 all the way to the end at measure 262. It actually is really in sort of two parts. It contains a lot of material drawn from earlier sections of the piece, but it also contains a bit of new material. Here's how it starts. And then that continues on for a while. There's a huge arpeggio sort of section, and a few other materials are brought back in, and then new material appears right close to the end. And so on until the piece trails off and ends. Now we move on to a beautiful theme in variations that is a nice rest from the first movement. Beethoven begins this with this chorale-like theme that almost elicits the sound of maybe a brass section playing with mutes. It's absolutely gorgeous. Then Beethoven moves on to the variations. Now, these are very interesting because Beethoven subdivides the rhythm each time, making it smaller and smaller and smaller before bringing back the theme again at the end. This first variation is syncopated, and it gives it the feeling of constant eighths, then followed by constant sixteenths. The second variation now has constant sixteenths, and it passes the melody between both hands. Then the third variation appears. This time, the subdivision is 32nd notes. This figure gets passed between the hands, as does the melody. And then it continues on like this for a while. The interesting thing about this variation is that rather than indicating repeats using repeat signs, as Beethoven did with the previous variations, he writes out each repeat in this variation, which is very interesting. He brings back this chorale-like theme at the very end, which really helps wrap the whole piece together and is a theme throughout Beethoven's entire career. Beethoven directly connects this movement and the next movement with a set of chords that appear technically at the end of the second movement. They're very dissonant and lead right into the third movement. And then the third movement. This third movement is much closer in character to the character of the first, but it's much more agitated and restless this time. Much of it is in piano or pianissimo, which gives the sense of conflict being suppressed and bubbling underneath the surface and just trying to get out. After a stormy introduction that foreshadows the primary theme of this sonata form, the primary theme appears low on the piano and in pianissimo. It's very, there's a lot of tension. It's extremely restless. After the primary theme, Beethoven moves into a transition that employs material from this primary theme, but also has a lot of new material to offer. Then, after this long transition, the secondary theme appears. It's in the dominant minor, and the melody appears in the left hand. Finally, there's a closing theme that is based off of the primary theme. Then the development section comes. Beethoven touches on pretty much every single motive from the exposition here, and he even mixes them, such as right around measure 135. He even introduces some new material right around measure 142. The end of the development, this colorful, softer, sort of textured section, is the first time that Beethoven breaks the perpetual motion that's been going on for this entire piece so far. After this, Beethoven goes back into the recapitulation, and this is pretty standard. The transition is shortened, but everything else appears exactly as one would expect it to. The real difference comes right near the end. If you notice, there are repeat signs at the end of the development and recapitulation, which is very unusual for a classical sonata, unless you have repeats around the exposition as well. But Beethoven doesn't. So this is a very interesting experiment with sonata. But the emphasis clearly is on this sort of second half of the piece, because then following this, there's an enormous coda, just as I said before, is very standard for this period. It's really in two parts. It begins with incipient binary form with chords in it. And then there's the 16th note section that utilizes the original melody of this movement in a very tragic, furious, very quick end. And that's the tragic end to the Apache Sonata. Finally, we go to Beethoven's late period, as exemplified in the Sonata Opus 109. This sonata really showcases the incredible range and genius of Beethoven's compositional ability when compared with the other two sonatas. Think of the Sonata Opus 2 number 2, whose primary theme is one of Beethoven's largest and contains a lot of individual material. Or think of the primary theme from the last sonata, Movement 1, which utilizes essentially one motive to create that entire exposition. This sonata contains an exposition that's incredibly short. The primary theme, in fact, only takes about 7 seconds to perform. And the secondary theme is only about 4 measures long. In contrast to the overall mood of Apache and the Opus 2, number 2, this piece is very succinct, introspective, and reflective. If we're going to use the food analogy we've been using so far, then I'd say this piece is like a glass of red wine that you might have on your porch while watching the sunset. Before writing these last 3 piano sonatas, number 30, 31, and 32, Beethoven had decided he was done with the genre of piano sonata. The reason was he just found it too limiting. He wanted to explore the rest of the musical genius he had to offer in the areas of string quartet, choral works, and orchestral works, for instance. In other words, 30, 31, and 32 are his farewell to the genre, and you can definitely hear this in them. In this period, Beethoven was attempting to communicate in a much more personal and direct way to his listeners. His music also grew a lot more lyrical than it had been in the past. All of these traits are absolutely exemplified in the Sonata, Opus 109. The primary theme of this first movement is extremely short, as I said before, but it's absolutely fascinating and intriguing. It's beautiful, and it's very interesting because there's not one single melody line, as in most of Beethoven's other works, but more, there are several different. For instance, the right hand is its own melody by itself, but also each individual voice in the right hand is its own melody. For instance, the alto line and then the top soprano line as well as its own melody. The bass has melodies as well, and it all combines to give this beautiful, rich 7 seconds that sort of launches this sonata. Then we get a loud transition and the secondary theme after that, which connects surprisingly well to the first portion of this piece, even though it slows down greatly. And it's just another testament to Beethoven's compositional genius. After this incredibly short exposition, Beethoven begins the development by expanding upon material from those first quick 7 seconds. Then after using this motive to move through a few different keys, Beethoven transitions back into the primary theme for the recapitulation. But this time, instead of there being space in the left hand is tied over each time it's played and appears in this descending bass figure that's really fantastic. Beethoven then moves to the transitional theme and the secondary theme in the tonic key this time. Then he moves into a section that's much like the development that utilizes the original motive from the primary theme And this goes on for a while, alternated with some quiet chords until we get the very end of the piece. Now, the interesting thing about the end of this movement is that it ties directly in to the second movement through a pedal that's held across the bars. And then the second movement. As you can probably already tell, this second movement is vastly different in character than the first movement. It's this more raging, furious sort of style that is, more characteristic of Beethoven's middle period. But the interesting thing that sets this movement apart and this whole sonata apart is that the loud, tempestuous movement is in the middle rather than being on the ends, framing a soft movement in the middle. After this primary theme of this sonata form, which I just played, we get a short transitional theme that goes as such. And goes through a bit of transition. And then we get a secondary theme that is actually based off of the second part of the primary theme. Then there's this sort of quieter transition into this magnificent closing theme that utilizes the same descending line that's present in the last movement, in the recapitulation, and also at the beginning of this movement. Now, the middle section of this is weird, and I do call it a middle section instead of a development, because this is really actually more of a hybrid sonata form. This middle section starts out sounding like it's going to be a development, but then switches into completely new material that's more quiet and just feels like a long transition back to the recapitulation. And then what's really interesting is that this piece, rather than leading to the dominant and then using that to go back into the recapitulation, it actually sounds like it's staying in the dominant minor because it ends on an F sharp, but then out of nowhere, suddenly we're in E minor again, and we're at the primary theme in the recapitulation. This moves through the transition before getting to the secondary theme again, which is, as you would expect this time, in the tonic. Then we get the stunning closing theme, this time in the tonic, as well as a codetta to finish off this second movement. The second movement is marked with double bar lines at the end. There's space. It's clearly cut off from the third movement, which sort of sets movements 1 and 2 aside as a separate unit that almost just to lead up to the third movement. When compared to this movement, everything that's come before so far in the sonata almost feels just like a prelude. This really is the slow movement of the sonata, but Beethoven's choice to preserve it towards the end demonstrates his move towards lyricism, beauty, reflection in his later years of his career. This piece is a theme and variations that starts off with this very serious, hymn-like, gorgeous theme. This theme is in binary form, and here is the B section now. After this theme, Beethoven begins his set of variations. This first variation evokes the sights and sounds of opera. It contains an ornamented melody over an accompaniment of chords. And then the end of this variation. The second variation is marked leggermente, which indicates extreme lightness, a bit of bounciness maybe, and some quickness. This variation sounds much like pizzicato strings in this first part. And then this part alternates with a section that's a lot smoother and sounds like arco strings now, bowed. This variation ends with an alternating chord pattern that leads directly into the next variation. This third variation is radically different from the theme, but it still feels connected to it somehow, even though all it retains of the theme really is its basic harmonic structure. This is a testament to Beethoven's ability to transform material while still helping it feel the same or at least connected to the original material. The fourth variation is sublime and very interesting. Here, Beethoven experiments with the effect of playing several different notes at once and then seeing how the sound changes as you take off one at a time. The second part of this variation uses a rocking figure and builds towards a majestic climax. Variation 5 is magnificent and fugato. It's pulsating, driving, and it demonstrates Beethoven's tendency to use elements of Baroque music in his late period. Then, the final variation. This variation comes as sweet relief from the chaotic polyphony of the prior variation. It's very sublime, transcendental, It starts with this chorale-like texture and then turns into triplets and later arpeggios before bringing back the theme at the very end. And this variation has the theme melody probably closest to its original form when compared to the other variations. It starts here with the melody in the alto line. And thus the variation continues with stronger and stronger trills. Eventually, this explodes into an arpeggio in the right hand up and down the piano over a trill in the left. This continues on, going back into trills for a while. And then, at the very end of this variation, Beethoven, as he's so good at doing, brings back the original theme to give a real sense of homecoming and closure to this final movement. And that's how Sonata number 30 ends. Beethoven, to me, does not feel like one composer. There are a lot of composers that when I think of them, I think of one particular impression that's kind of the same for all of their music. Examples would be like Mozart, Brahms, and even Chopin to a certain extent. But Beethoven does not feel that way. I hear pieces from his early period and I get a totally different feeling than when I listen to pieces from his late period. His first period is almost Mozartian or a lot like Haydn. It was very joyous, happy, lots of quick scales, not a lot of groundbreaking textures yet, because Beethoven is just mastering the techniques of his day. But then we get into the middle heroic period. Suddenly Beethoven is doing things with the piano that had never been done before. He's emphasizing extremes, he's going through tragedy, and you can hear this in his music. And then you get to the sublime late period, which is so much more contemplative, reflective. You hear elements of romanticism foreshadowed, as well as impressionism even. Beethoven has a true well of riches to offer across his entire catalog, and if you've gotten anything from today's video, I hope it's that fact. He has so much more to offer than the famous Fifth Symphony or the wonderful Moonlight Sonata, although it's still good to listen to these pieces every once in a while. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good day.